Milner interviewing Marjorie Montelius in her home in Carmel, California on January the 11th, 1991. Marjorie, could you tell me how you happened to become a social worker?
Well, I think it was by chance, because I surely hadn't known any social workers. I'd read a book, though, by Sinclair Lewis and Vickers, and that was the first time I'd heard about this career of working with different people. So that was sort of in the back of my mind. But I was also working my way through USC on an undergraduate basis, and I had an NYA grant. And I'd worked in the sociology department, and then for some reason was transferred to the new School of Social Work, which was just about to open, as I think a beginning part of sociology, with Arlene Johnson coming in as the new dean. And then I think as I stayed there and learned about social work, I just sort of drifted into it.
Yes, and that was about what year? Could you remember?
That must have been about 1939 or 40.
Uh-huh. You mentioned the...
Do you remember when Arlene Johnson went there?
I think it was in 40.
I think
40, And you mentioned the NYA grant. Those were initials, which I'm sure today's public would not understand.
National Youth Act.
Which was one of the Roosevelt's grants. And that I well remember.
It helped a lot of people to go through college.
Yes, I well remember it.
I remember, though, later on in my career, when I was telling somebody that I'd gone through school on the NYA grant, they told me I shouldn't mention that implied that you'd been a poor person.
We were poor people in those days, no matter who you were.
I know, I just felt lucky that I had it.
I'll say, no, they were very important. And I used to certify people for them, the agencies. And then you were in the School of Social Work at USC when Arlene Johnson was dean?
Yes. Well, she was dean even before I got into the school, because it seems to me I was her only secretary, because she had terribly high expectations of me. But somehow we managed to work through until she did get her own secretary, and then I was sort of more in a helping
So
role.
That was part of your NYA assignment, to be the secretary of the Dean of Social Work on that. Very interesting in that. And did you finish 1 year or 2 years at the school?
Well, I finished all the work for my master's degree, I think, in a year and a half, what they called an accelerator program, because this was during the height of the war.
I had that.
All my field work completed, and my classwork in August of 43, when I finished and was ready for my master's, except I hadn't written my thesis. I'd done all the research for it. It was about refugee children and other children who were sent from other countries to the United States during the wartime.
This was really in preparation for a job you were going to do later overseas.
Well, without my knowing it.
Without knowing it. And where was your field work at that time?
Well, that was a time when the schools required that you know something about casework, group work, and community organization, which I've never regretted. I think that was a wonderful way to begin your career.
Yeah.
My first placement was with the International Institute in group work, and there I had a group of young teenage girls of all different nationalities. And I liked that group so well that I kept the group all through the time I remained in Los Angeles. Then my first semester in a casework placement was with the welfare department, which was a real learning experience. One of the things I remember there is for Christmas I'd gotten a briefcase, which I was very proud of when I'd gone off to visit this black family. And I was sitting there with all my papers and forms, and a little boy about 4 years old said, "I know what you got for Christmas." And he pointed to my briefcase.
Sense your pride.
It really upset me that it was so obvious to a child. But that was in the days in welfare when before you could release a check, the client had to raise their hand and take an oath that you as a worker gave to them, that all that they said was true in regard to their circumstances, which again was a real difficult thing for me to have to do. Then my next placement, which I suppose was part of this accelerated business, was with the Family Service, the Child Welfare Bureau in Los Angeles, which I liked. I had a very nice fieldwork supervisor with a foreign accent. Dorothy Pagan, I think was her name. Very attractive woman.
Yes, I remember her.
Yeah. And then I was even offered a job there when I graduated, but by that time Arlene Johnson had sort of influenced me to take a job away from Los Angeles and away from my family, which I had agreed to. But it was with a lot of ambivalence that I kept with that job up in Vancouver. I'm glad I did, though.
This was a policy Arlene Johnson had, that you must get away and have different experience.
Was it? I didn't know
and then
that.
come back, and it was
I thought I was the only one that she wanted to tear from its roots.
No, she got me to go to New York.
Well, it was a good thing, because it was a real hard thing to break all your ties.
Sure.
But and it never really became easy, but it did make me realize that there were other lives to be led away from the life that you had been leading.
It broadened your whole perspective on things. Well, that's great.
Yeah.
So then you went from school where?
Up to Vancouver, Washington, which is right across the Columbia River from Portland.
Yes.
And it was a time of the war, and I remember two friends drove up with me in my little Model T Ford. We had to drive about 35 miles an hour, which was the limit then, and we were on gas rationing. And through Arlene, I had located a room in a home in Vancouver with the sister of the woman who was the director of the welfare department. So I think for about a year, housing was so difficult in those days that I lived in this little room in Vancouver.
That was quite common for the social workers to live in a private home.
Was it?
In a room. I did it. I know many social workers who did.
But as soon as I was there, I started looking for an apartment, and I remember reading letters that I'd written home. I would buy very fancy foods with my stamps and then hide the food, waiting for the time that I'd move to my apartment and could eat them, because in this room I had to eat all my meals out, so I didn't have a chance to do any cooking.
Yes. And your job up there was a child welfare?
Yeah, it was a real, very, very interesting job. It was a child welfare worker job, and Vancouver was crowded with all these people who had swarmed in from all over the country to get jobs at the Kaiser Steel shipyards. It was a tremendous employment opportunity. I think it was about the first time that Vancouver had black people, and housing was at a premium, and child care was absolutely not available. There were many, many problems brought to this child welfare department. All the ones that we know now, abandonment and neglect and abuse and adoption, all of it. But in just tremendous quantities.
This is really the early part of World War II.
Well, 43.
Yes. So
was that the
serious problems developing.
And a lot of racial problems, too, interracial.
Yes. Whole new experience of mixing populations. And you stayed there how long?
I was there through December of 1945. I went there with a very strict agenda. I was going to work 2 years in this public agency, 2 years in a private agency, 1 year in an institution. And then my plan was to go to Washington, D.C. and become chief of the Children's Bureau.
Wonderful.
And I didn't waver from this plan, for quite a while. I was quite a cross for the rest of the staff to bear. It's surprising that some of my dearest friends are still friends I made from that particular job.
That's very interesting. Very.
One of the things I did, I remember, when I was introduced to this job, all of the workers, the child welfare workers and the public welfare workers, were in this great huge room mostly divided into clusters of 4 desks. And I was given the choice to sit in one of these clusters or to have a desk that was sort of off by itself facing the wall. And I chose the one facing the wall because another one of my goals was to read an article each day from the social work yearbook. I think I probably got as far as C before all my plans went
It was your
awry,
only...
and I got back into a cluster.
The only private space you had. No, those were crowded offices in those days. No, that's very interesting.
And then you became aware right off the bat of the difference between the public welfare worker who worked with eligibility and financial affairs and the child welfare workers who were supposed to solve problems and develop support systems and were the so-called elite
Yes.
of the social work field.
Did you make home visits?
Yes. The only other trained social workers in this child welfare department were already the supervisors, and one was the community organizer. So all of the difficult cases were assigned to me as one of these graduates from USC.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a very varied and really a very difficult caseload, and a very heavy caseload. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I remember is I became the specialist for unmarried mothers, and I had such a large load of unmarried mothers that the telephone company allowed me to have a telephone because so many times I was called in the middle of the night to go with the young woman or girl for her confinement. I had such a large caseload. I remember my friends still teased me. They knew I really shouldn't take on another case, but they'd say, well, why don't you just go in the waiting room and look at her? And so I'd walk real fast through the waiting room, and I'd see the poor thing, and I knew that if I didn't take her,
of course,
you just didn't know what would happen.
Any help. Absolutely.
So she would be added to my list.
Of course. Was the war responsible for a lot of the unmarried mother situation?
Yes. Vancouver had a big barracks, and many soldiers from different parts of the country were transferred there to wait transportation out to their assignments. So a number of the local girls and the new arrivals, I think, became pregnant by some of these fellows.
Yes.
But also a lot of families from different parts of the country came with their pregnant person. Mm-hmm. Because they thought they'd have an anonymity and privacy, and that the child could be born and that they could leave and go back home. Because in those days, illegitimate pregnancy was not nearly as accepted as it is now. It was quite a disgrace.
Sure. Can you remember how much you were paid?
Yeah, I do. I received $160 a month, minus 20% for tax. And we were paid twice a month, so I think it was $70 every 2 weeks. And I lived from payday to payday. I was supposed to be, this well-paid professional person able to send money back home, but usually it was my asking for money to be sent to me because it really wasn't easy to live on that amount. When you had to eat all your meals out, you were responsible for your car's upkeep and the gas. I think you got some reimbursement, but it wasn't enough to really pay for the cost of driving. Mm-hmm. And I drove a lot because we had large numbers of children in foster care. Mm-hmm. And as is usual in the metropolitan district, many of the foster homes are way out in the country. And I remember one month I drove about 800 miles just back and forth on home visits. Mm-hmm. Part of that was nice because in those days Vancouver was in a beautiful rural setting, and there were these Camas and Battleground and a number of small communities where it was as though no one had ever lived there. Beautiful flowers and dogwood, and it
marvelous
was
country.
A great, great experience from that standpoint. Mm-hmm. Washington was beautiful.
Oh yes. How did you happen to leave there?
Well, I think part of it was still this plan I had that I was going to stay just a limited time. Yes. I already went 6 months past my limit. But the main reason, I think, is that I had a letter from Los Angeles recruiting me to be in charge of a home for adolescent girls in Pasadena. So I thought I'd kill 2 birds with one stone, get both the institution and the private experience in one fell swoop. So I accepted that job sight unseen. I didn't even know what was involved. If I'd known, maybe I wouldn't have taken it. But by the time I had moved myself down to Los Angeles and been introduced to the place, I was there. And the previous director left almost as immediately as I stepped foot over the threshold. So I didn't really have much choice.
Sure. And that was Rosemary Cottage.
Rosemary Cottage in Pasadena.
And how was that sponsored or financed?
Well, most of it was basically supported by the United Way of Pasadena. Mm-hmm. And then each girl who came was supposed to pay, part of the cost of care, either from her own family or from the agency that referred her. Mm-hmm. And this became a real serious issue as time went by, because it happened that most of the girls were referred from outside of Pasadena. So the United Way of Pasadena wasn't too interested in underwriting the cottage. All of these things at that point were a little bit over my head, but I remember many discussions we had as to why other, United Ways, like Los Angeles or the area that the girl came from, mm-hmm. didn't do more of this basic support. Mm-hmm. I don't, at that time I really wasn't too aware of how you did budgeting or kept an agency afloat financially. And I guess it's a miracle that we survived.
Sure.
I don't know how we did.
How you did it. How many staff members did you have at that time?
Well, we didn't have very many. I was the director, and I was the only professional. We had one house mother, and we had a cook. But I think when I first went there, none of those positions were filled. So those beginning few weeks were really terrible weeks, because the place was pretty full of girls, and they were almost running the place.
About how many girls?
I think the capacity was 20, mm-hmm. and I think there must have been about 14 or 15 girls there when I arrived. Mm-hmm. So in addition to having to kind of get on top of the girl situation, I had to begin to recruit staff and develop some procedures. I lived at the cottage for the first 2 or 3 months because there wasn't anyone else living there, so I was doing the house mothering as well as some of the other jobs.
It's impossible.
It was really a difficult job. I know I didn't even get out of the place until about 3 weeks after I was there.
You couldn't have any...
On my birthday, I finally made my way to a public telephone to call and complain about what had I ever gotten myself into. There were some really difficult girls there. 2 of them were part of a group of triplets. The third was a boy who, thank goodness, wasn't at Rosemary Cottage. But those 2 girls really had complete control of the institution, and they'd had this control even under the previous director. They were very, very strong-minded. Mm-hmm. And I remember that it finally came to a point where I lost my temper so completely that I can remember just shaking as I confronted one of these girls to battle it out, that it was either she was going to run the place or I was.
Sure.
And I won. Mm-hmm. And from that day on, it was under my control. But my mother had always worried about my temper. I sort of thought, looking back, that in some cases you really need one, and that was the day that I did.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'll never forget that. Their names are Dolores and Darlene.
Unforgettable names.
Unforgettable. But many of the girls were really wonderful girls. Many of them were just going through the normal adolescent acting out or withdrawal, whatever, and they didn't fit into foster homes. Many of them been through a series of foster homes and never felt really accepted. I developed then the philosophy that many adolescents really do work out better in a group home when they get the support of other girls, if there's a supportive environment.
I agree.
And I think it turned out that it was a constructive place, I think, for most of them.
Excellent. Can you remember the names of any of the board members who were particularly helpful to you?
I remember the board president that was there most of the time was a woman I really admired and I learned a lot from. Her name was Rita Mrs. C. Reynolds. And she was a real warm, outgoing, friendly person. She'd been an actress. So she had a different approach to life and to this kind of an institution than some of the women who were on the board. Many of them were elderly women. It was an all-woman board, for one thing. And many of them were very controlling, and they had their own ideas about how girls should be raised, and weren't too comfortable with self-government and girls making decisions on their own, and older girls being allowed to go on dates, and sort of going through the same experiences that girls in their own homes had, which I sort of felt they should be having. But with the help of Mrs. Reynolds and Mrs. Riggins and several other people, the board membership gradually changed, and they became much more supportive. I remember when I first went there was an empty lot on the next to Rosemary Cottage, and it was filled with trees, apple trees and peach trees and cherry trees. And I remember that some of those women thought that I should be able to keep care of those trees and to bring in the fruit, and that was another time when I really was able to say that I was not employed to be the orchardologist, and that there was no way that I could take on the responsibility of those trees. And I think eventually that land was either sold or it just didn't belong to the cottage. But that was such an unreasonable expectation. But it was a time, I think I learned on that job that as an executive or as a social worker, you had to put your foot down with some of these lay people who run boards. And I think it stood me in good stead as I went through the years and through a number of other boards that there's a role for both, but it isn't a superior-inferior role. It's an equal role. And if you let a board take control, you're really out of luck.
Yes.
So I don't think I ever had a board who I had a battle with as I did with that one. But it worked out.
Sure.
I should say I had a lot of help from you and Mr. Class, too. We used to come out and help, and I never will forget the time that I was leaving the Rosemary Cottage, and we were having a farewell dinner, and you were there. I don't know, was Norris Class there?
No, he wasn't there.
But none of the girls would speak to me. And I was so embarrassed, and I felt so bad because I wanted to demonstrate how fond we all were of each other.
Yes.
And here no one would even talk to me.
Well,
There were a lot of hard experiences. I remember a lot of the girls were really sort of emotionally disturbed, and I'd have to take them to the child guidance clinic. And I always felt so apologetic about that. And I remember that sometimes I called the social worker, which I needn't have done, but I was sort of insecure too, and I'd say, I just hope that they wouldn't believe everything that Naomi said about me or the way the cottage ran or whatever, but it was just that same ambivalence you have about knowing people are talking about you.
When you work with adolescents, you can expect it.
But they were a handful, and they sure presented every problem, I think, that's known to humankind.
I think so.
Because there was quite a turnover. I think during those 3.5 years I was there that we had about 200 to 250 girls.
Yes.
Just really a lot of them.
No.
One of the things that's interesting, I don't think we had one black or one minority girl. We did have one from Hawaii named Lalani.
Yes.
I remember her because once she broke the refrigerator door when she slammed it real hard.
No, I think throughout the Los Angeles area, including Pasadena and so forth, there were hardly any blacks or Chicano youngsters in institutions. And I know there were active committees trying to change this policy.
You mean even now?
No, at that time. I think really never was changed greatly until about 1950. So, can you remember any other special problems in child welfare in the area at the time? The shortage of services or...
Well, there really weren't many services available to these girls. Many of those who were even referred by sort of sophisticated social agencies, when they came, the story was that they would be receiving their casework individual services from the referring social worker. But somehow or other that never happened. And basically I could understand why, because most workers were also working with heavy caseloads. But it did turn out that each of those girls had to become pretty much my client. And that was sort of difficult because I had to be sort of their caseworker on an individual basis, and yet the disciplinarian and the administrator on another. And I can remember one little girl, her name was Shawn. She was about 13 or 14, and she was really wanting very much to be accepted by the other girls. And evidently one test of being accepted was to smoke. Well, this was a terrible violation of procedure to smoke at Rosemary Cottage. But I remember one evening telling her, one time when we were talking, that, for her to go ahead and smoke, if this was important to her. But if I found her out, she was surely going to get punished, just like the other girls. But it must have been sort of confusing to them.
Sure.
And I know we go through times when we'd give demerits, and then we go through times when we give merits. I'd have charts with stars on them, and charts with minuses. Everything that was on the books we tried. But on the whole, I don't think any of them were damaged by my being there. But I don't know how much. I think some of them were helped.
Oh, I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were.
Good experience.
Yeah.
Except towards the end, and I still don't remember all this. I think there became some recognition that more of the girls were seriously impaired psychologically, and that they should have more of a treatment center. And so I don't know how that Winifred-Zwamer got involved, but they did employ a psychiatric social worker to come in. In fact, I think when I left, they had to employ about 3 or 4 people to take over the various jobs. I know that they increased the house mother ratio, but I don't know whether it worked out to have it be more psychiatrically oriented or not. Do you?
No, I've really not kept close to the agency in that. I knew it increased its size of staff, and I think of girls too, the number of girls served. But
many of the girls stayed in touch with me for some years afterwards. Even when I moved to San Francisco, some of them came out to visit, and they wrote, and I heard about their getting married and different things.
It means a great deal. It shows you had a good relationship.
And then those are the years that I became involved sort of with the Alumni Society at USC. I didn't really have much social life those years, though, because that job was just so demanding. I had a real cute apartment down in Pasadena, right behind Colorado Boulevard, where the Armours and the Cudahy's had used to have their summer homes. I had one of those units. And that was a lot of fun because I was able to entertain and to have friends over. And it was I was particularly popular on the Rose Parade days because people would come in to use the facilities. And so it was a good experience.
Oh, absolutely.
And I learned so much from Rita Reynolds and her husband because they took me under their wing and, learned about art museums and going to the best hotels, and it was really enriching from that standpoint. Wonderful. And I did learn eventually something about budgeting.
No, that's wonderful.
It never has been my strong point, though.
Nor mine. Then when you left Rosemary, you decided to go where?
Rosemary, again, I was recruited. I think, it was a confining job for a young person. I remember, I told you I was only 29 years old when I took that job, and one of the big things we used to do would be to go to the beach. That was always a big thing in Los Angeles, especially in those days.
Sure.
And the girls there all called me Monty. Everywhere I've gone, I've had a different nickname, but at the beach, it always sounded like they were yelling "Mommy," and it sort of got to me that here I was, not really old enough to be their mothers, and yet being called "Mommy" by all these huge teenagers. So I think I was getting ready to leave, and had a contact in San Francisco that wondered if I wouldn't like to come up there and try a new job that was being created by this agency to start a root work program with immigrants at the International Institute.
Yes.
So I took that job and really learned a lot and enjoyed that.
And was this largely focused on helping them to orient themselves to life in this country?
Yeah, this was 1949 to 51, and this was enough after the war that a lot of immigrants were coming into the country. A lot of Russians and Germans who had left their countries, and many of them had gone to the Philippines or to Samar, different islands, or different, I don't know where they were, but they were coming in by the boatloads. In fact, I remember once going down to meet a boatload, and here were all these people from these other countries. They were sort of behind barbed wire. It made a great impression on me. And many of them had a real hard time adjusting to life in this country, because many of them had been professionals in their own countries. And here they were lucky if they could find a job as a caretaker or a janitor. I remember one man, his name was Dr. Primo, and I always referred to him as Dr. Primo. He said, "I just wish you wouldn't call me Dr. Primo." He said, "I used to be Dr. Primo, but now I'm a janitor, so just call me Mr. Primo." But I continued to call him Doctor. But many of them were men of that kind, of background. And then we had a lot of the Filipino scouts coming in from the Philippines. These were men who were really isolated from their families, but had the opportunity to come to this country and took it. A lot of Indonesians for some reason. I don't quite know why they were coming in. But one of the things we did, I worked at the Institute as a student when I was in Los Angeles, where most of the activities were developed along nationality lines. Like you had a German club and a French club and a Spanish club, whatever. But in this institute, we decided to do it differently, and that is to choose the subject and then have the people come regardless of their background, because we thought if they were going to learn to adjust and adapt into America, they better learn to work with each other. So we had social groups. The one that I remember as being most successful was a group of young adults called the Worldlings, and they were young people from all over the world, and they developed their own system of leadership and their own social programs. I remember one of the problems I had, it became basically a social dance group, and I hadn't had a chance to learn how to dance. So I had to rush down to Arthur Murray's and take a series of dance lessons so that I could participate in these dances. And I remember how differently the men from the different nationality groups danced. You know, the Latins with their tangos, and the Indonesians would hardly touch you, and that you'd still have to sort of keep up with their dance style. We had a film program where a man from the public schools came out and showed films about America. That was very popular. And then we had a lot of English as a second language classes now. Discussion groups, all kinds of groups. And then a real popular group was a dramatics class led by a very wonderful woman named Georgette Bonasso. She they did some plays that were already written, like You Can't Take It With You. We even had that out at the Little Theater at Golden Gate Park. But they developed some plays on their own, based on their experiences. One of these plays that they did was called Nostalgia. One of the real active participants in those dramatics clubs was C.Y. Lee, who wrote the Flower Drum Song.
Yes.
And a couple of other books.
Yes.
He has one that's not too... It's fairly recent.
Yes.
I saw in the library the other day.
And reproducing the play.
But it was a real good experience. I had students then from the University of at Berkeley, and then also worked very closely with the casework staff, because this was a multi-function agency, casework and community organization, and caseworkers did a lot of work in the languages of the clients, and then we would meet and sort of discuss their problems from an individual standpoint and as to how they were participating in groups.
Was this located in a central place, or did you have sub-offices out?
No, it was located in a beautiful old Victorian mansion out on, it wasn't Broadway, it was on Jackson. It's been torn down since. But the cable car used to go right by it.
Sure.
And it was a real lovely old building.
Yes.
It wasn't, too functional, but we functioned.
No, very good. Was there an employment service connected with it?
Yes, the caseworkers usually handled the employment services, although we did have some groups about how you prepared yourself for employment interviews. The other big thing we did, I've almost forgotten, was every month we get the names from the immigration department of all the people who'd arrived in San Francisco the last month. So we'd write them invitations to come to this open house that was held once a month. And it was always fascinating to see the crowds of people that would come to these open houses. I guess it was sort of the first official invitation they'd had as a new immigrant. And those developed into wonderful evenings. And, then people from the more established groups would begin to develop and to plan and present the programs and to mingle and get the other people included. It was a very good introduction to life in this country.
Oh, I should say. Did that program continue after you left?
Yes. In fact, I think one of the things I've enjoyed in my work is having students or staff to work with and sort of prepare for their own careers. And the fellow that was my assistant there, because the program did get to be pretty large, was Tom Brigham. And Tom stayed on with the Institute for some time after I left, and then eventually became the Dean of Social Work at the Fresno State College.
I remember him.
He was a dear man.
Very good.
He developed multiple sclerosis. In fact, I think he might have died because I didn't have a Christmas card this year. I had to call check on that. But what would...
Yes, I just wondered whether after the emergency needs of immigrants to the war, whether they continued the program.
It continued, and then the International Institute, after I left, sold that building, and they moved into a much larger building on the basis of this participation on Van Ness Avenue in San Francisco.
Yes.
And that's where I eventually became the director, but that's some time ahead.
Yes. Very good. And from here you went to what program?
Well, from the Institute, I think by this time I'd forgotten about my schedule. I heard about these Fulbright grants, and this was also a result of the war, where Senator Fulbright thought it would be good for American professionals and students to go abroad to other countries and really learn about what other countries are doing and teach some of the things that we were doing. You had to have a project, and the proposal that I had was to visit institutions for adolescents, because I still was very interested in that from my experience at Rosemary. And following, a number of different procedures for eligibility, I was selected to go on this Fulbright and left in September of '51 to England. And that was really kind of a plum, because in many of the countries you had to have a different language.
Yes.
And because I didn't have a second language, I was lucky to get to England.
Wonderful. And
there I had a very good experience.
Were you stationed in London?
I was stationed at Bedford College, which was in London.
Yes.
But I had a very rich experience because I had a very good sponsor who arranged for me to travel all around England and to stay in different institutions from 2 weeks to a month sometimes. And sort of in between placements, I'd be able to go back to London to stay in a central place. So I had the best of both worlds. It wasn't always really fun, but I remember I stayed in a home for unmarried mothers, and I stayed in a remand home, which is for delinquent girls, and one is Dr. Bernardo's homes for just children of any age or size. The big thing I learned there was how almost all of the future staff of Dr. Bernardo's were the children who were cared for there. They were sort of geared into keeping the institution
stay within
going.
the family,
Did you know that?
I'd heard that. When I was in England, I learned that. He really raised them to raise each other. It was always a questionable practice.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
They just weren't ever exposed to any other possibilities.
Yes.
They just sort of geared into this service right off the bat.
Yes. What were some of the distinctions you found in the care of adolescents in England and those in the United States, if there were any special ones?
I really did. Well, I did see They were much stricter in the homes in England. It was much more punitive, even for girls who were dependent, not delinquent. It just seemed to me that if you didn't have your own home and had to be placed, you were expected to behave in ways that other girls weren't required to, which I found sort of difficult. They weren't allowed to go out in the community by themselves. They always had to be chaperoned. The girls who had babies when they were unmarried were expected to give them up for adoption, whether or not they wanted to keep them. It was much more restricted.
Yes.
Than I think in our country.
Quite punitive.
They did have more treatment homes at that time than I'd been aware of in our country, but it might have been that I just didn't know the ones over here. Mm-hmm. I think they were doing some real good experiments. I think that was about the time that Anna Freud was working in the care of children.
Yes.
And I think there was some new law that was just enacted during that period. They were beginning to evaluate their own experiences with child care and beginning to want to make some changes. They didn't really have professional social workers, I remember, because they were wanting to have some experts come over from America to sort of evaluate their training experiences. And I remember that was one of the times I was able to help Arlene, because I suggested her as being the ideal person to lead such a group. And I think a year or so later she did.
Uh-huh. No, she came to England and stayed.
She had a Fulbright too.
Oh, yes, she did. Where did you report back on your Fulbright experience?
I reported back to Miss Sybil Clement Brown. She, I guess, was quite outstanding. She was a very austere woman, and I remember I upset her once because I asked her, was I supposed to call her Miss Clement or Miss Brown? I'd never heard of a hyphenated name before. And she looked down at me. She was quite a tall woman. She said, my name is Miss Clement Brown. So I learned. I also got acquainted, I can't remember how, with Barbara Wooten, who was a real outstanding economist. And she was a fascinating woman. She was very, very erudite, a brilliant woman. And she married a taxi driver on the basis, she said, of proving that an educated woman and an uneducated man, or vice versa, could live a perfectly normal, happy life together. And I didn't really get too exposed to their lives, but I still felt there were quite a lot of distance between the two of them. And then one of the best experiences of that year in London, or in England, is for about 8 weeks towards the end of my time, I lived in the room of an actress with the BBC, Gladys Spencer, and her specialty was accents. She could do any accent anybody needed. So she was always on call for the BBC to do different accents. And through her, I met quite a number of the different actors and actresses from BBC. And also became very familiar with the theater, because the theaters at that time were really inexpensive. And I just went a lot of times.
That's great.
And then during the summer, when I left England, I think in June, when the academic year was over, I had 2 or 3 months on the continent, in France and Italy, and really had a good time then.
Great.
Living on a pittance, but it was fun.
Sure. That's great. And were your experiences there written up? And
well, we all had to write a report, and the report that I wrote was included in the Fulbright report for that year.
Yes, so it's been published. And that would be what year? About?
51 to 52. It would have been the 52 academic
year. Be in the 52 edition.
The other thing I should mention is we were presented at court. We met Prince Philip and Princess Elizabeth before she was crowned.
Yes.
And I always remember her speaking in that real high voice, how fortunate they felt to meet us, and that we must remember that she and her husband had never had the advantage of higher education. But she surely had a lot of other advantages. And then I remember when I came back one time to England, her father had just died, and how all of London was in such deep mourning. All the stores on Regent Street, were decked in black and purple. It was really a real tragedy kind of.
Yes.
You could just feel the sorrow that the people felt about his death.
They really have adoration for royalty.
It was a real rich experience.
Yes, very good.
Yeah. Some of the Fulbright students that year had kind of a miserable time. Some of them, it was real new. I think this is about his second or third year, and some of the sponsors didn't really know what to do with their people, and some of the people didn't know what to do with themselves. So for some of them, it was just sort of a time-dragging period.
Yes.
But I just really felt lucky that I'd had the people in charge of my program that really went to work on it.
Sure. Oh, that's wonderful. And then you came back to the United States?
Well, then I really wanted to go back to San Francisco, but I didn't have any job in hand. And it seemed to have been always the case. When I left one job, I really had to have another job waiting, to not miss too many paychecks. And nothing. Finally, I guess what happened is that I had a letter from the University of Chicago that I'd been accepted for a mental health scholarship there, which I really didn't have much to choose from, so I took it. I don't know whether I thought that I wanted to get a PhD or not. Anyway, that was the one thing that seemed possible. Although looking back, I think it was a mistake, because it was the year of my whole professional life that I liked the least. For one thing, I have never been geared into psychiatric social work. And I can't explain why that is so, but it just is taught as far as I'm concerned. But I just had a bad time there. I lived at International House, and I did make some good friends, especially a girl who married a Greek nomarchy. We had some real good times with her.
You can continue.
Well, anyway, that year at Chicago was just kind of a low point. My field work was at the Institute for Juvenile Research, which is formidable in itself. My supervisor was called Marjorie Brown, and my first contact with her was being given a case that I didn't think had anything, that I didn't see what I could do with it. It just seemed like such an ordinary case. So I told her I'd appreciate having another case. And she said, she thought that was appropriate for me. And I said, I'm not used, Miss Brown, to take cases that I don't want. And she said, it's time that you get used to that, Ms. Montelius. So we started off with a beautiful arrangement. And it just went from worse to worse.
Sure. Except
I don't think I did too bad with the clients, but I couldn't do well with her. I developed a terrible tic. It was just awful. In fact, at the very end of that experience, I either read or somebody told me that they thought my ego was so strong that it needed to be tested. And they tested it. Did you ever hear anything like that?
Yes.
I just thought that was absolutely cruel.
Stupid.
That they should have tried to build on the strength that I had instead of knock them down. And then that Miss Perlman, I just got so confused. What it turned out is that what I was thinking was right, but I couldn't understand her language. I remember one example she would give of a person being in a box and how they would do this and do that. You could never relate that to a human being as a way of solving problems. But I did have some good experiences, because I did have Charlotte Toll with the dynamics of learning, and she was the kindest, nicest person. And took a little bit of interest in me. It wasn't on this cruelty tactic. And the other person I really learned from was Alton Linford, because I took every course I could from him in administration. And then this friend of mine, Julie, who was in the same fieldwork placement with me, did a lot to protect me from our supervisor. And one of the things I did, which I should be ashamed of, which I'm not, there was a big social work convention, and she was to give a paper about working with a difficult graduate student. So I took Peter Sandy, and knowing that I was going to be her prize example, we went to her meeting, her section room. And I never forget the look on her face when she saw me walking in, because I'm sure she had to adapt her paper. She was going to probably say how you broke down a person's ego and tried to build it up, but she had to delete that. At least that's my impression.
Oh, that's funny.
But I know that the day I finished that, I knew at that time that I never wanted to go on to have a PhD. It was such a waste of time. Some of these really intelligent people who are taking 4 and 5 years out of the prime of their lives to spend around this school, wasting time, I think. Al Feldman and Francis were there, and I must say they were a great comfort because I could see them once in a while and did things with them as a family. But I know that Al was having a hard time with his PhD too. I don't know.
He would never have followed through on it, hadn't been.
But I could see then that there was nothing I wanted to do, and teaching was not something I wanted to follow.
Sure.
But the day that I finished my last class was the day I got on that plane, and I never wanted to see Chicago again. In fact, I've never been back. It's a very dismal city as far as I'm concerned.
Sure.
So then I went back to San Francisco, and without a job, without any hope. Well, I did find a summer job at the Red Cross, but I really wanted kind of a decent job by that time, and there just didn't seem to be one in the Bay Area. I had another, someone I must have known in the state of Washington called to see if I'd like to work on the state staff up there as a child welfare representative. And again, it seemed a better part of valor to take a job. So I took the train up there and stayed for a year. That was a real interesting experience. At that time, I think Washington was considered to have one of the best child welfare programs. They really expected a lot from their child welfare workers in the field. And those of us in the state staff, we didn't actually supervise the field workers, but we had to see that they lived up to the state expectations in order to get their funding. I was assigned the 8 or 10 counties to the farthest east, going from Ponderay in the north to Walla Walla in the south. And the way it worked is you would drive out, and I think I had 8 or 10 counties, and because it was such a long drive from Olympia to my territory, I was expected to stay out 2 weeks because I couldn't come home for the weekends like most of the people did. So that got to be kind of a job because, you made friends among the child welfare staffs in the different counties. They also held you at a certain distance because you were there to sort of monitor their work. And there were 2 or 3 of them that really weren't living up to the state's expectations. So it really wasn't much fun. And even if you went out with them socially in the evening, it was still kind of work. Those are the days when no one called each other by their first names. If there's any difference in status, you were always Miss this or Miss that or Mr. So we had fun back in Olympia because it was a real strenuous assignment for me.
Sure.
I would just go back just exhausted. And we had a very good supervisor, and she always sort of knew how to help you pull yourself together. Mm-hmm. And so you'd have a couple of weeks back in Olympia with a round of social activities and whatever, but then you'd be back in the field again.
Sure.
So I liked it in a way, but I must say I was glad when I had another letter back in San Francisco to take a job teaching at the University of California. And while it wasn't my particular favorite subject, it was group work, it was an opportunity to get back where I wanted to go.
Good.
So that job lasted from 54 to 56, where I taught full-time at the university. And it really wasn't too bad, except I found out what I really knew, and that was I didn't really enjoy teaching. It just seemed to me it was too much using yourself through other people to do the fun part of it, which was the work. And
sure.
I just sort of felt kind of wasted. But one of the things I did like is you had to supervise the workers in their fieldwork placements, and so I became acquainted with all of the different agencies throughout really the whole Bay Area, from Agnew State Hospital up to the Folsom Prison, because we really did have students in a lot of interesting new kinds of placements. I think group work was really becoming quite the thing then, working with people in groups. And I was able to relate a lot of it to casework. In fact, taught casework for group workers. Group work for casework, casework for group workers. Taught cultural factors and social workers after hours. And then one of the interesting things I did was I started a group myself over at the Florence Crittenden home, not the Florence Crittenden, the Salvation Army home in Oakland, where I worked with the Unmarried Mothers in groups.
As a volunteer.
As a volunteer. And one of the things that was interesting there is that we learned through staff meetings that the girls often said in groups things that their caseworkers had been trying to pull out of them for weeks and had not ever found out. And I made some really good friends there. One of the friends, Helen Robinson, was the supervisor. She's the one that was really influential in my coming down to Carmel.
I see.
But so that job was all right.
Who was the dean of the school at that time?
Dean Chernin.
Dean Chernin was then dean.
It was a year that I think 4 or 5 of us joined the faculty. Betty Pfeiffer, Jean Hoodwin in medical social work, and then my favorite, and who became a very good friend, was Lydia Rappaport, who really was a star in the psychiatric field.
Yes.
And who died way too young.
Yes, she did.
But those of us who were new formed a little cluster and sort of taught each other about teaching these classes. So it wasn't altogether bad, but it was just not my milieu. I really sort of liked to be out on the front line.
Sure.
And so what happened then is that the director of the International Institute of San Francisco, who was a dear friend of mine, was retiring. And they were looking over the field and eventually invited me to take on that job. Mm-hmm. So I did go over to that job in 56 and stayed to 61, 5 years. Mm-hmm. And the first 2 years I continued to teach the group work courses, and then Jean Bolton was brought in to do some of the teaching over there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And the Institute at that time was going through an interesting stage. It seems like the immigrant status changes each year. Those were the years when the Hungarian refugees, the revolution took place, and the Hungarians were coming in by large numbers. Mm-hmm. And they needed a lot of help because what I remember the most about that was that the established Hungarian community, which had not been established that long, were very resistant and very critical of these new Hungarians. It seems to be sort of a pattern that repeats itself, that the established nationality community is very critical of the newly arriving one. And the Hungarians really had a hard time of it. Mm-hmm. And it was also a period when I think when the countries were experimenting in bringing American Indians off the reservations into urban areas. And while they weren't really immigrants in a way, we considered that they were in relation to their cultural background, and we did a lot of work with those American Indians.
That's interesting.
But they had a real hard time, and eventually it was recognized that that program didn't work, this transferring from the reservation to the city.
How many Indians came into San Francisco area?
I think there were several hundred.
Hundreds of them.
Mm-hmm. It was also the time the Japanese war brides were coming in, because I know we had a very large group of Japanese war brides.
Yes.
And for them, we didn't have just a war bride group. They really needed a group of their own. Mm-hmm. And they had one. I know we had a Japanese student who sort of worked with them. Their cultural background was so different. They needed so much help, and were having so many problems with their American husbands.
Sure.
And then another group that was very big was the Philippine Scouts, who were still here pretty much without their women, and were beginning to feel it.
Wasn't there a law against Philippine women coming into California?
I think it was very hard for to get them through immigration.
I think it was outlawed for a long time.
And then they weren't getting their veterans benefits. There were just a lot of problems they had. We had an outstanding Armenian worker who worked with the Filipino Scouts. And I know that I was involved in helping her to get the Caution Award that year for the work she did with them.
Yes.
But it was an interesting few years at the Institute. As I look back, it was one of the quieter times of my life, but we had a good professional staff.
Great.
And a beautiful building, one of the really old Victorian buildings in San Francisco that just sort of lent itself to the program. But somehow I don't remember that I felt pressed. I seemed to need to feel like I was working hard.
Sure.
And I became real active in the NASW and did a lot of things off the job that seemed to be all right because the job just sort of sailed along. It wasn't that hard.
Sure. Wonderful. Wonderful experience.
But it was a good experience.
Yes.
I had my own, a beautiful little office with its own bathroom, a little couch, where I could take naps on.
Perfect set.
It was a nice job. But basically, it still had the same kind of social work program that we'd started at the other institute, several years ago.
So really a transfer of knowledge really throughout your whole experience.
Yeah, they all sort of connected.
Very much so.
And then from that job, I had another letter, this time from Los Angeles, asking if I'd like to go to Hong Kong. Well, I think in all of my born days, I'd never even thought of Hong Kong as a place. And it was such a letter just out of the blue from a woman I didn't even know. But Lydia Rappaport was living with me at the time. She was in the process of getting her house rebuilt. I remember reading that letter and saying, this is a strange letter, and I have a feeling I'm going to take this job. And in a few months, there I was off to Hong Kong. I should say that year before I left for Hong Kong, I was president of the NASW in San Francisco.
Yes.
And I think maybe one reason I took Hong Kong was to get out of that. But Hong Kong, that goes back to the child welfare again, because the basic program there was to arrange for the adoption of abandoned Chinese babies in families outside of Hong Kong, because at that time Hong Kong didn't have an adoption law, so that even European families who lived in Hong Kong couldn't adopt a child while they were there, nor could the Chinese families who might have wanted to adopt. So with a lot of legal rigmarole, it was possible to get the Chinese children adopted by approved families in other countries. International Social Service had offices in, I imagine, 20 or 25 countries at that time, all of which had qualified social workers. What did I say last?
Yes, that you were going to Hong Kong
about the purpose was to place these abandoned babies in homes, and we worked through established agencies in the United States who do the home study, and then would send us these studies to propose a child on whom we had done a study.
Yes.
The study was just done pretty much on the impressions of the staff in Hong Kong. All of them were Chinese except for me. And none of them had the same kind of social work training that we expected adoption workers to have in this country. But they were pretty astute, able young people, and they surely knew the Chinese culture. And basically there wasn't much you could learn about these babies because they all had been abandoned and they were all in institutions. And no one knew what their background was. So you had to take them sort of at face value. And even at that time, there weren't even any psychiatrists in Hong Kong. So even with the older child, say 3 or 4 years old, you couldn't get any help to determine whether the child was intellectually okay or anything else. But that staff, I think there were about 8 or 10 workers, social workers there. And I supervised all of them. They all were assigned various institutions. And then we go over, we call them the PAPs, the prospective adoptive parents. And then we try to figure out how to match a child to the family. You could surely do it by sex. Although sex really wasn't a problem because there were hardly any abandoned baby boys. They were almost all girls. The only boys we got were those with hair lips or TB or something radically wrong with them. So we had a female population. But we tried, this is important to the staff, that as many of the children as possible go to Chinese adoptive families. And then what I learned is that the Chinese are as concerned about color of skin as blacks or any other nationality group. So we'd have a real hard time trying to figure out whether this child's skin would match the skin of these unseen paps in another country. I think on the whole these adoptions worked out well. It sounds so nebulous to do that kind of matching when you know how it's done by some agencies in this country.
Yes.
But on the whole, I guess it went well. And then the procedure was that when you had 5 children ready for adoption in another country, you arranged their flight, and one of the staff accompanied the children to the destination, caring for them en route, but with a free trip back. And this became a very, very popular thing for everybody to do. And I know that I benefited from it because I traveled to the Philippines and to Australia, took a whole group of children down there, and to England, and I even had a child in Ireland. But for the Chinese staff who never could have afforded a trip outside of Hong Kong, this was really a great activity. Great. And during those, I guess I was there 3.5 years, we were really part of the American consulate. This program was sponsored by the High Commissioner of Refugees out of Geneva. But the money for the funds for the program were expended through the United States consulate in Hong Kong. So in some ways I became like an ex officio member of that staff and really had some very good experiences there. I lived in the beginning in a very small apartment. When I took the job, the woman who recruited me said that a $600 a month salary would be like a $5,000 salary in this country. Sure. Well, it turned out that she was very, very wrong. And I think I was on a harder economic level than any of my staff. Some of the staff used to come to work driven in limousines by their servants. Yes, but I had a miserable little apartment the first year and really hardly any money to spend. This woman really had given me a line. But by the second year, it was recognized that my salary was way too low. So that first year of window shopping really paid off. I was able to buy some of the things that I'd had my eye on for a long time. But it was a real challenging kind of a job because the Chinese workers were very suspicious of Caucasians. And in fact, this woman who had recruited me, who'd been indirectly related there, had developed kind of a bad reputation because she treated the Chinese as servants, just really as underlings. She'd have people take her shoes to be repaired or to go out and bring her a sandwich or, just that real autocratic kind of a pattern that is so distasteful. But gradually I think the staff learned to trust me a little bit, and we did get to be on good terms. I know that they were so suspicious in the beginning, no one of the staff would come to see me by themselves. If anybody had a problem or wanted to talk about something, I'd see this group at my office door where they present the problem, but always as a group. And they had their offices, their desks, all in a group, a great big room, where they really couldn't do the best kind of work because they were having to talk to people on a confidential basis. So I remember that somehow I was able to bribe them into accepting individual offices if they could choose the colors and sort of the style of their office. And then we kept a big room that was sort of a playroom and a room to help the children, because we did have a number of older children, to learn what it was like, what a house was, and how you went into a house, and what a bed was, and all the things that they really didn't know from their experience in institutions. So it really did work out. And then one of the women who was very, very able became my assistant director. And when I left Hong Kong, after a lapse of a few months, because she refused to take it until she felt she could really handle it, she became the director. Mm-hmm. And in that time, there were no Chinese directors of anything in Hong Kong. They were all led by Caucasians or Europeans of one kind or another. So I feel I made some entree into the system there. And was also on a committee with the old Canadian worker and a couple of other people who developed an adoption law for Hong Kong. Mm. And so now adoption is possible there. And in fact, they do. The ISS still continues in Hong Kong, but it's become much more of a refugee serving agency and almost like a traveler's aid. Get their annual reports every year still. And it's grown by leaps and bounds. They just have become a very widespread agency, but no longer is adoption one of their big jobs. The other thing I did while I was there was to teach at the University of Hong Kong, and the course I had was a course that I really wasn't geared for. It was growth and development.
Interesting.
But what I remember about that is how I'd have to study at home to just be one class ahead of the class I was teaching the next week. It was a subject I wasn't too clear about.
Sure.
And I remember the difficulty I had when I really came to grips with this edible complex, because how could you teach about the edible complex to Chinese who've been raised by Amas, hardly knew their parents? It really sort of brought home to me that maybe it wasn't all the gospel truth or a gospel fact. And then I remember I'd be asked to give lectures at different places, and mostly to groups of social workers or people working in the social work field. And one of the things that intrigued me and still does when I see people talking and then they're being translated is I'd make a few remarks, and then the person who was translating me would get up and talk, and he'd talk way longer than I'd talk. And during the time that he talked, there'd be these roars of laughter, nothing of which I had said had been funny. And so it gave me a real
I get amused on
strong sense of insecurity. Did you ever go through that?
No, I have, but not.
But afterwards I'd ask, the translator, what in the world had he been saying?
I know, I think he's editorializing what you said.
But whether it was to my advantage or not, I'll never know.
Of course, no.
But again, I made some real good friends there.
Mm-hmm.
And
was there, while you were there, a man named Peter Chow on the faculty?
Was he a doctor?
Well, he was later. He came and got his doctoral degree from our school.
That name does seem familiar. One of the things that we did, that I had to do, was the ISS didn't have a board of directors. So we had to establish a board of directors. In fact, one of the ISS American board people came over to help do that. Her name was Mabel Ingalls, who turned out to have been the granddaughter of J.P. Morgan. And when she was there, we lived in high style, taking trips on these boats around the Hong Kong harbor and eating at the best restaurants. And then another kind of nice advantage I had was being semi-attached to the consulate. I became what can only be called the extra woman. You hear a lot about these extra men, but I remember being invited to the consulate when Senator Tower was there and 2 or 3 other high officials from the government to go to the consulate. They did everything according to rank, and so I was often down at the end of the table, but it was still a real wonderful, interesting experience.
Sure, wonderful.
And then I did get some really good travels to many different parts of the world, and also had a lot of company. Gene Bolton's parents came and visited me while I was there.
Oh, did they really? How nice of that.
That was a hard... that agency became hard to keep funded, too. And although I think what really motivated me to think about leaving Hong Kong, because I liked it in many ways, although it was really an isolated kind of job, was I was there when Kennedy was shot and killed. And I remember listening to the Voice of America about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, my time in Hong Kong, and hearing about the cortege in Washington, D.C. And it just seemed to me that I had no reason to be in Hong Kong any longer. Things were so bad in my own country. It was really very moving. They had a tremendous memorial service in one of the big churches there in Hong Kong. And I remember that the staff all brought me presents or messages of condolence as though it had been a personal loss. And yet none of them wanted to go to this funeral service. They said, he was your president and you go, but they didn't want to go.
Interesting. How very...
I also took Chinese lessons there because I wanted to be able to speak a little bit, but it's a very difficult language. I had a Chinese teacher who could come in, I think 3 days a week on my lunch hour. But I think the big problem was that I don't think the Chinese people want other people to learn their language, because none of the staff would help me. And the same word in a different tone could mean a very different kind of a thing. And they would just go into hysterical gales of laughter when I tried to speak, or they'd tell me that I was saying something that I didn't want to be saying. So
you get in trouble.
I didn't keep up with that very much. But I really learned to like, well, I always liked the Chinese people, but it was a great experience.
Yes, wonderful experience to have.
That second year I even had an ama, which made it real nice.
Absolutely.
And then when I went back to the States, again I had to have a job to go to, and this time it was going to Washington, D.C., where I must have applied for it, but I don't know. In fact, I had gone and been interviewed. It was to be the group work consultant with HEW, the Bureau of Family Services, because Lyndon Johnson now was the president after Kennedy was killed, and it was the beginning of his great society, and the HEW was geared to services of every kind and you could mention. And, you know, I think it's a great loss that we still don't have some of those services. But one of the big ones, a very popular one at that time, was learning to work with people in groups, mostly problem-centered groups, but groups of people who needed to learn how to apply for a job, people who were on their first job and needed to be kept motivated to continue on the job, women with various kinds of problems. There just didn't seem to be any kind of a problem that there couldn't be a group built around to help. Eligibility. The welfare departments were saying that they had to spend too much staff time clarifying eligibility procedures. Could it be done better in groups? Well, that became my job. I was in a special little unit with 5 specialists. One was in homemaker services, one was in community organization, and one was with volunteers. And then I was with the groups.
Yes.
And somehow this group business became very, very popular because working for the government, we couldn't initiate the contact. It had to come from the field. And my specialty became very popular. It seemed I'd be no sooner back from one assignment that I had a request to go out to another. And I was quite the envy of the rest of the people in my unit because nobody seemed to be that interested in volunteers or homemakers or community services, but they all wanted these group services. So, you know, I met you then in Tulane, but it was really great looking back, except again I don't evidently thrive on these travel jobs. I didn't like the one in the state of Washington, and this one I would be out sometimes as many as 3 weeks out of a month. You know, I no sooner get home than I'd be packing to go out again.
You can't have any personal life.
You couldn't have any social life at all. In fact, I don't think I had any in Washington. I did have a little house, which I liked real well, and then I had 3 cats. But the expense of keeping those cats while I was traveling got to be quite stupendous. But I surely got to see the country and learned to give speeches. I also learned the hard way that all these conferences that social workers have depend a great deal upon the employed civil service people for their speech makers. So you didn't have to be particularly talented to become on the agenda, but I gave a lot of speeches in those days, never with a lot of comfort.
I bet.
But I think my heart was still in San Francisco, so after 3.5 years, I guess, in Washington, and liking it to some degree. And I should just go back to the Children's Bureau, which has been my first objective those many years ago. I found out that working for the Children's Bureau wasn't just on the basis of merit, because there was a job opening in the Children's Bureau, which I really wanted, and which I was very highly qualified for, and which I learned afterwards had already been promised to somebody who knew the chief, even before the job was advertised. And what really bothered me was that they would advertise it when they'd already made their selection, going through this kind of false business. Anyhow, that disillusioned me completely, so I gave up then every thought of being chief of the Children's Bureau. But the job opportunity I learned about then was Traveler's Aid in San Francisco. So I flew out there and met with a number of the board people. Didn't know whether it sounded like the right kind of an agency or not. I'd never done that kind of work before, but I knew I wanted to get back. So I started there, I think, in the fall of '67. And that, of course, was the summer of the flower children, when all the children in the United States were going to San Francisco to escape what they thought were the middle-class values of their particular communities. And that turned out to be really the most challenging job I think I had, and I stayed with it the longest, 13 years, and I really liked almost every minute of it. It was a changing job. Those first few years was mostly working with these young people, and working with a lot of other agencies, both professional and lay groups who were concerned about them. The Diggers, I don't know if you remember those.
Yes, I do.
Huckleberries, which was started for runaways. It was very hard, I learned, to get institutions started under state requirements. No one under the age of 18 could be placed in an institution unless they had parental consent. And most of the children had run away from wanting any kind of parental contact at all. Many of them were 18 and older, and one of the first things we did was to get a facility started for young stranded adults, basically the homeless that we're talking about these days. So we had this real good facility called Aquarius that was a spin-off from Traveler's Aid. It lasted for several years, funded by different foundations, mostly the Rosenberg Foundation. And as soon as I learned about the foundation game, I really took it up with a vengeance. And I don't think for the rest of my time there, we were ever without 2 or 3 foundation projects, just covering the gamut. We had an after-hours street program where we had fellows on the street who worked with stranded youth or stranded people of any kind. I know towards the end we had a psychiatric project called The Tender Lion, and it was to provide psychiatric services to a number of established agencies. It was also the time in California when Reagan was letting all of the mentally ill out of the hospitals. On the basis, and I guess this was an honest assumption on his part, that the community would develop services to serve them. And there was plenty of money because San Francisco got a good share of it, and I was very active in what was called the Northeast Mental Health Program. The northeast part of San Francisco being in many ways maybe primarily the most disturbed community in San Francisco. It was the Tenderloin, and our offices were in the heart of the Tenderloin. But we developed services of a variety of kinds, services to prisoners, to gays, to the different nationality groups that made up that particular area. I think a big problem with this program was that you had to depend so much on indigenous leaders. There was a real put-down during those years of professionals, and that wasn't easy to do. But a lot was accomplished, except, as we all know, the programs failed for a variety of reasons, and now the mentally ill are on the streets in greater and greater numbers.
Very tragic.
I don't the Tenderloin was surely bad enough when I was there, although in those 13 years I never really had a difficult experience. I've almost forgotten the biggest thing that we started was the TLC, the Tenderloin Center for Children in Crisis. And this was a daycare program for the women who were living in these rooms in the Tenderloin and had no place to leave their child, often not enough to feed them. And so we started this, it was supposed to be a drop-in center for children at the YMCA. We had their whole big gymnasium that we converted into a daycare center. We provided breakfast and lunch and tried to keep it so that mothers would use it only 3 times a week so that we could serve a larger number of children. But it turned out that you had to have some of the children in every day because their home circumstances were so difficult. But we had trained social work staff there as well as with daycare centers, and that program is still going on. So I'm real pleased about that.
Very good.
And I guess still going real well. I think a little bit later, after I left, they also started a Head Start program down the Tenderloin. And I think that the psychiatric program was picked up by the Catholic Social Service. So a number of services we did get started down there that are continuing to go well.
Yes.
But that was a very rich experience. I used to get kind of upset with myself for staying so long, except then I could see that everything, the job was changing under me rather than my having to change by going away. And we developed a really good staff. And they had a terribly hard job to do because these people had so little going for them and were a very unpopular group to serve because they were new arrivals, they had no roots, no nothing. And yet, I think a lot of them were helped. And a number of the staff who got their experience there went on to really better jobs.
Yes. So. I think it was your Aquarius program where you used an old hotel where elderly people were staying and you moved the hippies in with the elderly and they got along very well.
That was the beginning. That was in the old Victorian Hotel.
Oh,
in fact, the other day I was in San Francisco and
I always
saw
thought that was a wonderful story.
That was the beginning. And they worked out real well together, too.
I'm sure.
Then it turned out that the man who ran that hotel was an alcoholic and we couldn't stay there. So then we moved. Then by that time we had our own building out in the avenues. And then that worked out real well until in the beginning, when you start a new program, you have staff who are dedicated to the idea of the program and they'll work for very small wages because they're so committed.
Sure.
But then as they keep the program going and they kind of compare things with other agencies or people, they want more. And they were Aquarius was able to keep going for quite a while on a competitive basis, but then you can't keep an agency going forever on foundation grants. And there were no public funds for able-bodied young people who were homeless. Maybe there should be, but there weren't.
Yeah.
But I think we all learned a lot from that.
I think it'd be invaluable. And you were there 15 years?
13.
13 years,
And I left a couple years before I needed to, but by that time I'd had my house down here for a long time, and I was really interested in starting a new life.
Well-reserved retirement.
That was a real hard job, too. One of the hardest things, which was awful, was a couple of years before I retired, our office was set on fire. I'm sure it was arson by one of our staff, a very disturbed fellow that we shouldn't have had. Wow. But I remember I was called in the middle of the night by this fellow and went down and the whole office was absolutely gutted. It was the most miserable experience. We had to rent space in a different building for the caseworkers to operate out from. But I had to stay in this burnt-out building with one single globe hanging over my desk to keep up with the workmen who came periodically and, try to keep the agency afloat. It was just a real bad time. The only compensation was that our insurance covered us enough that once it was rebuilt, we could get all new furniture and new equipment, and it turned out to be kind of a modern building.
Yes. Wow.
So I guess there's...
In the long run, it paid.
But that really was awful. And I think what was the worst was knowing that one of your own staff did it.
Of course.
In fact, what we heard late afterwards is that this fellow was so disturbed that he was under suspicion of murder.
Oh dear.
I took an awful lot of chances on staff, more than probably I should have, at least according to some of my other staff.
Yes.
But
you had to, the clientele you're dealing with.
I always felt that was part of your job. If the schools had allowed people to get social work training and a degree, you had to have some confidence that they weren't as sick as some of them proved to be, but some of them were.
Yeah.
Not many, but this one was a particular one.
Remember, we sent you one who's probably...
Was that one? Was that?
Wanted.
Yeah, I remember. That was another reason I wanted to leave.
Yes.
Yeah. But looking back, it was way, way more good than bad.
Oh, sure.
All the way through.
No, you gained a great reputation there for what you achieved, whether you knew it or not. We knew it in the South because there's not nearly as much being done for the hippie group or the flower children in Los Angeles area.
Well, I can't help but think that if I'd stayed with Travelers Aid, during this time of the homeless, that we would have had more going for them.
Oh, I'm sure.
I can say that it evidently has a good director now.
Yes.
A woman, I forget her name.
Good.
But we had two men who just were horrible. So about 8 or 9 years of Travelers Aid were just wasted. But now, I just had a letter at Christmas that people are beginning to read about Travelers Aid again. I think they have started a home for the homeless. But it takes, a certain kind of a person. It takes a lot of energy.
Oh, yes.
And initiative and, just fighting. So many people are scared of foundations, and I really get very provoked with them because I think basically they've taken away the money that would ordinarily have gone to agencies by taking it themselves because there's more prestige to it, and then having the right to decide which agency should get it back.
Of course.
So I really have been pushing foundations. In fact, I'm back on that foundation trail now because I'm involved with a non-profit group that's buying a building.
I see.
And trying to get...
for the League of Women Voters?
No, the League of Women Voters is one of the non-profit agencies. But it includes the Red Cross and the YWCA and Alzheimer's and, I think there are 10 or 12 of us.
Yes.
But it's $1 million building, and we've raised, $300,000 or $400,000, but a long way to go.
Sure.
But I'm back in the grant writing again.
Well, very good. Once a social worker, always a social worker.
I think that's true.
I think so.
Like when they ask you what you do now, I don't know what I'm supposed to say, a retired social worker or a social worker, or I always feel like I'm still a social worker.
I just leave the "re" off and say a tired social worker.
Well, except I haven't been tired. I really have enjoyed my retirement.
No, I think it's wonderful that you're giving volunteer services here.
Well, goes both ways.
I knew you were active when they were electing a movie actor's mayor here.
Yeah.
You're active in the political scene.
I was on the planning commission.
Aha.
Yeah, sometimes I think that